Okay, our piece to discuss about prior knowledge and conceptual change is the three conditions and the three grain sizes. So, if it's okay with you, I'd like to start with the three conditions. I
Okay.
just found that really interesting to connect our experiences and the things we learn to our prior knowledge and that importance of making those kinds of connections. And so, the three conditions, the first one is missing. And that one's pretty straightforward because you're missing some piece of prior knowledge that is going to help you either reach some sort of conceptual understanding or better understand and relate that experience with your real life. And so it's like you just haven't had an opportunity to really have that piece of knowledge, but maybe you have some related knowledge that could be called upon, right? The second one is your knowledge is, your prior knowledge is incomplete. And in that case, we have to just help them to fill in the gaps. Whoever our learners are, we help them to fill in the gaps. So they just have, perhaps they know this much, or they've had this many experiences, but they're missing some piece that we can just help to fill in. And then the third one is the misconceived. And I think this is the one that we end up worrying about the most a lot of times. It's like people have prior knowledge. And some of that prior knowledge, what we are doing is we're trying to make sense of our world. And so sometimes our everyday experiences might not match exactly what the normative view is. And so we're helping them to reach that level that we're considering to be a more accurate understanding, or providing more experiences to help them reach a more accurate understanding of something.
Okay. Well, that sets up actually nicely with the three grain sizes of how when our learners' prior knowledge is misconceived. And I find it really helpful to think about just another way to think about how learners are misconceiving things and how they're wrong, right? Because otherwise, I think about, okay, well, what you said is wrong, and as if all wrong answers are the same, right? But they're not. So it's nice to see how thinking about like perhaps individual beliefs, that grain size, that is where they're wrong at, right? So thinking about like how sometimes learners think that all blood vessels have valves, right? I mean, it's just an individual belief, and sometimes they could just read the text and the text says it's not, and they're like, oh, okay, well, I just misread that, misunderstood that, or whatever, and that false belief is corrected. But then there's also this idea, another grain size, thinking about mental models, where mental models are these individual beliefs connecting together, and how individual beliefs are related to each other. And I find that kind of analogous to like the concept maps that we make, right? So you have like all these post-it notes with like individual concepts, and we draw the lines and we explain how these ideas are connected to each other. So that's how I'm seeing mental models, and to think that maybe sometimes learners they don't have a mental model on a particular idea. Maybe they didn't have prior knowledge, as you were saying, right? Or that their mental model is incomplete. There are chunks of things that are just missing. Or it's actually misconceived. That mental model is just organized or wrong. The connections are not quite right. And I can imagine that if you've had a lot of experience with something, but you've organized it all, the connections are not quite right, then it sounds like, when you're saying the wrong answer, it's actually quite complicated, right?
Yeah, that's interesting, because then you could see why, if they have this mental model, that they are making sense of these things. They have made that connection, but it is perhaps a misconceived connection, and the connection is either different than the way they're perceiving it, or the connections need to go through a couple of other places before that connection really makes a lot of sense for them.
Yeah, and it's interesting to, everybody connects it differently, right? Because even though they might say the same answer, their ways to get there are very different, because all of our experiences and the way that we see things are different. And what stands out here is just calling out, I find perhaps hopeful, is thinking about how their flawed mental models, right, when the mental models are not quite right, actually can be transformed. It's giving me the sense of hope that we can change, right? And then if we've pieced things together not quite right, we could actually address that. And how, in some cases, identifying critical false beliefs and addressing that could actually do a lot of good than just trying to identify all the places where the beliefs are wrong.
Well, and I think as educators, we the more that we experience and share our experiences and teach learners, the more we know where some of those critical false beliefs might lie. And
really?
So, for example, on the Phases of the Moon activity, we specifically used this idea of the critical false beliefs when we introduced this idea of shadows, to start out the whole experience with shadows rather than starting the experience right with the phases of the moon. And lots of times people are going, what? Why are you starting with shadows, right? But that idea that we discovered that it was a critical false belief. People think that the earth is causing the shadows that cause the phases of the moon. Whereas when we have them experience this shadows and see that it's the moon itself that is causing that shadow, that hits directly at this critical false belief that we found was getting in the way of people understanding the phases of the moon.
Oh, wow. That's pretty impressive. And I have definitely recognized how that can be addressed. Then the last grain size that they talk about here has to do with categorizing, which I find really interesting. Also thinking about how, like, we categorize things all the time. It's such a perhaps natural thing that humans do from baby. I'm just thinking of my son, right? And how he's like animals versus plants, and that's alive and that's dead, and how that's, like, on that level, a very simplistic way of thinking about categorizing, right? And sorting things out. But then I can imagine how it can get complicated and can get in the way if I've miscategorized something, like, for example, heat. How oftentimes our students think about heat as a thing, right? And I think part of that comes from the way that we talk about heat. Oh, that thing is hot. That thing has hotness. That thing is, so it's as if it's a property that something can possess. So it's as if it's a thing, right? When in fact, actually, heat is a process. So if I'm thinking about heat as a thing, but then everything else, I can imagine how that can be a huge stumbling block, because I've just totally miscategorized the idea. So then no matter what you say, it's not going to fit to help me explain things. But I could nod and say, yeah, and then make you think that I understand you.
That is a pervasive, long-standing categorization mistake, because even when you get to chemistry in college, it's like that is one of the difficult concepts that faculty have to address, is this idea of temperature and heat. It's pervasive, and it lasts a long time. So that's a really interesting idea about tackling it at the level of category. Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how these ideas, thinking about them as educators, how when our learners are students or whomever, our visitors, are saying things, and sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong, right? And oftentimes we nod and cheer them on when they're right, and then when they're wrong, we politely nod and not make them feel bad. But perhaps thinking about asking them to tell me more. Can you explain, so that they can see, and for us to also understand where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm. Well, even for the right answers, they could have the right answer for the wrong reason too, right? So that idea of really explaining and pushing on this idea of, oh, tell me more about that, I think is so important for both the right answers and the wrong answers. And wrong answers are so complicated that they're really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's bring other people into our conversation.